Good morning. We'll set this up in a second. I think it's 3. That's the one. This is, I love coming to Scandinavia, thank you, primarily for the weather. No, really, because there's something about living in Los Angeles that deadens you to the world, because the weather's always so good and people. One thing we noticed right away was how adversity, I think, makes you stronger. And there's something about living in darkness that gives you a certain kind of depth that living in perpetual sunshine doesn't. So it's wonderful to be here. I have to say that I'm here with my wife and son, and that's him. And we're lugging around our luggage and lugging him around too, and getting on buses and getting off buses has been quite an interesting challenge since nobody came to meet me at the airport and in the Compassion Conference. And consistently, people have come to help us lift really heavy luggage, and it's been really moving, actually, and 100% of those people were women. So Tor, maybe you can explain to me why that is later. But anyway, I put him up there because he's now 10 months. I think he's going to show up later in the afternoon. And the troubling thing is he's even cuter in person. But it also means that my wife and I haven't slept in a year. So if I say anything that makes sense, or that is even remotely interesting, let's consider that a win, okay? So anyway, as Tor mentioned, I teach at a school of management. It's not a school of business, it's a school of management. And so my students aren't just bankers or the usual suspects, but they're also NASA scientists or physicians or police officers, museum managers, all sorts of human beings. And about 15 years ago, we had the realization that things were going to get tough. Right? And for all the things you talked about, we needed to cultivate leaders' inner capacities, not just their ability to map strategies and work finances and all that sort of stuff. But how do you actually have a robust way of managing all the stuff that happens inside you so that you can deal effectively with the stuff that happens outside you? So I set out the challenge for myself was, how do you introduce awareness practices in a management context, which can sometimes be very conservative, without arousing an immune response? And so that meant having to think through all the things that you're interested in, but to have it be relevant and appeal to a particular context, to this particular context. So I set out 3 rules, and that one was that what works very well in one context may not work at all in another context. So it couldn't be therapy. We didn't sing songs, and there was no involuntary touching. So we don't end any program holding hands in a circle, doing the hokey pokey, and because people would go run screaming from the room. And so how do you introduce this in a way that the kind of target client I had in mind, or target student I had in mind, was a conservative white male who lived in Orange County. He drove a Mercedes. He lived behind a gated community and was either a financier or an engineer. He could be an evangelical Christian. He could be an atheist. And so how could you structure a rhetorical, practical methodology that would appeal to him? Right? Because he wasn't likely to show up at a meditation center or something like that. And at the same time, he was suffering. Right? And that there was nothing in his world that would allow him to explore that, really. Nothing in his social circle, maybe nothing at home. Right? And so how do you help that person? And so, actually, just a quick question. How many people know who Peter Drucker is? Curiosity, okay. So, he's considered to be the founding father of management, and the Drucker School was named after Peter Drucker while Peter Drucker was still alive, if that tells you something. And he was really kind of a Socrates in a way, and that management in the 20th century and early 21st century was really guided by him in a way, and he's worshipped as a god in Japan. When we hear the word management, we think of business management, but Drucker's real intent was how do you create a society that worked? And he was a realist enough to know that utopias were, somehow we think utopias are kind of impossible, but dystopias seem to be very possible, but I don't know why that is. But anyway, his goal was how do you create a society that functioned? And so he also talked about the importance that in the West that we've overtrained in analysis and we've undertrained in perception and emotion. And when I found that, I thought, okay, that's the key. Right? We've overtrained in analysis and we've undertrained in emotion and perception. He was a great collector of Japanese ink brush paintings. And he said, they didn't teach me much about Japan, but what they did teach me was how to see. And you can find this on the net. There's an account of somebody coming to visit him, wanting to know what she should do with her life, and he sits her in front of one of these paintings, and he says, how many colors do you see? In a black and white ink brush painting, she says, well, 2. And he says, look again, And then at some point, she realizes that there is an infinite number of shades of gray. So this idea of learning how to see is really part and parcel of what we do. So, the idea that we have a functioning society and then we have functioning organizations, and that management was was the methodology that these organizations function. And then Drucker also had this idea that you can't manage other people unless you manage yourself first. And when I found that, I realized that, wow, management education is about managing everything else but yourself. Right? There's nothing about any of the stuff that happens inside. And so I set out for myself the goal to how would you create that system, and that maybe what happens that if you had a functioning society and functioning organizations, you needed functioning humans to do that, and that the practice of self-management had to bolster the practice of management itself. So so we have 21 weeks of self-management training at the Drucker School, starting with attention, then managing your nervous system, and managing attention, and then managing difficult emotions, and then managing change. So I think we are probably the only business school in the world or management school in the world that has that. One of the basic frameworks we use is this one, which if you know Stephen Porges' work will look familiar, is the idea that every human being has a zone of resilience. And it's their capacity to absorb or deal with stimulation. And that once you kind of overload that, we move into what Jim and others talked about yesterday, of kind of a defensive response. Too much energy, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and your head doesn't turn off. But also, you move into states of aggression or escape. And then the more advanced form, which is too little energy, of giving in or shutting down or disconnecting. I did some work in Japan about 10 years ago, and I thought this workaholic society, we would be talking about too much energy. And what we ended up talking about was how so many of these people, this organization's colleagues, had too little energy. They couldn't get in the elevator to come to the office. They couldn't pick up the phone to make phone calls, or one guy couldn't open envelopes because they were so overwhelmed. Their biology was so overwhelmed that they couldn't take action. Right? So our fundamental model is a biological one. We look at the motion of movement of energy that happens within you. And as Sheila and others mentioned, what is implied in this model is that there are no negative emotions. Right? There aren't negative emotions and positive emotions. I decided that's a ridiculous way of classifying emotional experience, right? Because, as you talked about, right, anger can be powerfully motivating if you know how to manage it, right? And so so what we learn how to do in this practice is how do you increase your capacity to deal with stimulation, and then how do you return to your zone of resilience once you've left it. And oftentimes it means sending a good number of my students to therapy, quite frankly. So I have this backbench of trauma therapists that we tap to send people to because they have a difficult time regulating. So, this model of parasympathetic or social engagement, which is, kind of our complex human interaction, and then our survival systems that get activated is kind of part and parcel to what we do. So anyway, I wanted to state that at the beginning, and that informs what happens next, which is what I call the 4 rigors. How do you cultivate the 4 rigors? Now, we all know conceptual rigor, right? And this is the I think, therefore, I am part of modernity. Right? So, we cultivate conceptual rigor. But there are other rigors, too, which is like perceptual rigor. How many colors do you see? Right?
What's the word rigor?
Rigor.
Stivbenhet, fastlåsthet.
Thank you. Rigor, like, let's see, this is like, remember, I haven't slept in a year and a half. No, these curveball questions defining simple words on stage is so difficult. A kind of depth or skill or precision, thank you. Right, thank you. Yes, thank you, fellow English speakers. Right? So having precision, in this case, conceptual rigor, not just intellectual rigor, but precision in knowing, what are your belief systems, what are your assumptions, what are your judgments, what are your rationalizations, what are your justifications, what are the stories in your head, right? And that perceptual rigor is precision about what you're seeing, right? Shilla talked about projection, right? Are you seeing what's actually here? What's actually in front of you? One of Drucker's great lines was, the future's already happened. It's just that most people don't see it. Right? Because you're using a map of reality that's outdated. And so how do we start to see the map that we're using to navigate the world? Then there's somatic rigor, right? Which is the precision in knowing, well, what's happening in your body? What is your body telling you? Which oftentimes many people have a huge issue with. They don't know what their bodies are telling them, right? Or even the fact that they live in a body. Right? I went to the University of Chicago, where the only concession that you lived in a body was that on Wednesdays you could get a milkshake for $1, and that most of the time, you kind of lived somewhere outside your body. And so, without that source of information to tell you, what are you actually feeling, right? Which leads to the 4th rigor, which is emotional rigor. Right? Oftentimes people don't know, and then so they make kind of disassociated decisions, based on mental rumination that may have nothing to do with anything. Right? So these 4 rigors are applied, cultivated and applied in a way to, so we have this kind of rigorous engagement with our own experience. What are you actually experiencing? And if you start to see your life as a series of moments, informed by an analysis of what you're actually experiencing, right? And what are you actually experiencing right now? How does that translate into action? And how does that action translate into a result? Then you start to be able to see what are you actually doing, and what is it? What are those efforts or actions returning to you? And are those things that you want? And oftentimes people have no idea what they do, why they do it, and what they get in return for that. Right? So how we practice mindfulness in this case is very much action-oriented, and that we use the meditation practice to bolster the capacity in the 4 rigors, but it's applied in their life. So, every person I work with, I said, don't work with me. Or on the syllabus of the class, I said, don't take this class unless you're really ready to look at what are you doing. Right? So we start to see, that informs this capacity to make usually better choices. And about halfway through, so 13 years now, I've been teaching, and about halfway through, I started to call up my old students and say, what did you get out of this? And I've never taken my own class. And what did you get out of this? And I got an answer I didn't expect. The answer was, what I got out of it was the capacity to learn how to create choices. How to create choices where I didn't think there were any, or that my emotions said there aren't any choices here, or I was so fundamentally attached to my assumptions about how things were that I couldn't create options. And now I learned that life can be a kind of play. Right? I can work with my mind and change my external circumstances. And that's the fun of it, right? And so I call this bending the future. Right? You do something differently, you do it over and over again, you get a different future. It's in a way, it's really that simple. So what I thought I could do is talk to you about some cases and of what happens. There's a systematic stair step into experience that we do. And the first one of which is just learning how to manage when you go out of your zone, basically, right? And what do you like when you're there? And then once we kind of pass that stage, then we move into what I call transforming perception. So imagine this. You have a very difficult client, right? And yet he's your most important client. Right? And if you didn't have this client, you'd be in trouble. And he's demanding to you to have a meeting. And you have to drop everything, and in this case, fly across the world to meet him. He's a big guy, he's a loud guy, and quite frankly, he intimidates you. You walk in, and your goal in the meeting is to get it done with so that at the end of it, you can go drink. This is the scenario one of my students right now is dealing with. Right? This is an example that is 2 weeks old. You walk into the meeting room, and you decide this is the first time you've met this person. What happens? What do you notice? You're more open. Curious. You're listening, yeah. Right? That's exactly what happened to my student. He said, I decided I would let go of all my memory and imagine this is the first time I met this man. And what I noticed was here was a person that was very passionate about what they were doing, but he was also terribly afraid. And when I saw his fear, my heart broke open. And it totally shifted the nature of our relationship. And he didn't know what was going on. And the meeting went so well that afterwards we went drinking together. So this is one of my Japanese students who had to suddenly drop everything and fly from LA to Tokyo to meet with this guy. And we had just done this in class. And he writes back saying this was pretty interesting to watch. So what often happens is that people can't step out of their memory, right? They can't step out of their reactivity because the reactivity is too strong. And so that leads to the next stage. And we have a variety of different tools and frameworks for learning how to manage the reactive process. One of which is watching your reactions to the names in your email inbox. And one of my students, a young manager, comes back. We do this exercise, and he comes back and he says, "Oh God, there's this guy. I'll call him Eddie Lopez. Eddie Lopez. Whenever I see his name in the mailbox, my blood just starts boiling." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And this guy, he manages a support team in a materials manufacturer, And he says, well, you know, Eddie always bothers our team with his kind of incessant demands about everything. He wants everything done yesterday, and he'll show up next week to pick it up. And he's a pushy guy, and you know, we just find him an irritant. And I said, okay. And so we kind of worked through the students' reactions about Eddie, and you know, how did anger show up in his body? What were the stories irritation told him? You know, how did that motivate action? And then we switched the camera. I said, okay, so let's talk about Eddie. You know, is Eddie a bad guy? He's quiet. No, he's not a bad guy. Eddie's just an annoying guy. Right? And I said, all right, so then why do you think Eddie's doing what Eddie's doing? He said, well, we have you know, in our company we have an East Coast team and we have a West Coast team. And Eddie's actually, and one of the reasons why, you know, I'm so irritated is Eddie's actually assigned to the East Coast team. But the East Coast team doesn't help him, so he calls us because he knows we will. And I said, okay. So Eddie's not getting the support he needs from his own team. So you've just identified a management problem, right? And so what else about Eddie? Is he married? You know, yeah, Eddie's married. He goes, oh yeah, come to think of it, his wife's like 8 months pregnant. I said, okay. And so what does Eddie want? He goes, well, he needs this information to work on this new client that he's trying to get. And if he can get it, it's a $10 million deal. All right. So let's just stop here for a second. So you think Eddie's not a bad guy, Eddie's an annoying guy, but he's assigned to a team that doesn't support him. He's trying to get a new client because he's got a wife and a new kid on the way. And is that right? He says, yes. And then suddenly my student looks down at the ground and he says, oh my God. He said, you know, I created this whole story about Eddie. And because I created it, my team believes it. And so we all have this very negative story about Eddie. But if I look into Eddie's world, you know, Eddie's just trying to take care of his family and do a good job. And he starts tearing up. I said, so what's happening? He goes, what I noticed is that I want to pick up the phone and call Eddie and ask him, how can I help him? Right? So, Brooke and I were talking last night at dinner. There are two kind of models of compassion. Right? There's the notion that compassion is something you build. And then there's the notion that compassion is something that's already there and you just uncover. And I think in our conversation, I realize I'm in the uncovering school. Right? Like once you take away the reaction, you know, and you help people just be present, you know, what happens? What happens? Right? The third level is then, you know, once you've worked with kind of momentary reactivity, you start to notice, oh, it's not just momentary, that there are patterns. Right? And then how do you start to dismantle them? I had a student once who was very volatile. And he was a big guy. He was actually my target client. He lived in Orange County, behind a big gated community. He was trained as a financier. I'm pretty sure he's an atheist. And he would call me up he used to be an investment banker. An angel investor, and he would call me up after every class to tell me how I could teach it better. And that there was one line in one of John Kabat-Zinn's books that we used in class that referred to climate change, and that he in the middle of class one day pounded his fist on the table saying how resentful he was to having to be made to read extremist political literature. And so he was a difficult guy. And about 10 weeks into the process, I walk in and his face had completely changed. And I thought, okay, what's going on? And so I said, okay, you meet out in the hallway, let's have a chat. And I'm looking up at him and I said, so something happened to you and I want to know what that is. And he said, well, something happened over the weekend and I could see myself in a way, and the stories I tell myself about how sorry I am, how pitiful I am. He feels sorry for himself a lot. And then I realized that through the work we've been doing, that I'm not the only person in the world that suffers. And tears are coming down his face. A year later, we became good friends, actually. And what I find oftentimes is these guys are really just teddy bears inside. And one day we had lunch, and he's plowing into his rare steak meal, and he says, I was thinking about what we're doing to the earth, and I'm worried about my kids, and I think we have to do something about it. And I thought, okay, that's a huge change for this man. So anyway, once you start to see, you collect data of these data points, these little dots over time, you start to realize, oh, you have patterns, and that the patterns kind of form your perceptions and actions, and then the later stage of the process is how do you actually start to dismantle that. And one of the people that I'm working with right now, one way of identifying people's patterns is to notice what are the sentences they say out loud in a kind of reflexive way. And this person is one of the leaders of her firm. She's very well respected. She's incredibly talented at what she does. And one of her phrases is that I'm responsible, I'm responsible, I'm responsible. And as a result of that, she is overwhelmed constantly. And so part of our work is to help her not be overwhelmed. And out of respect to my good friend, Dr. Doty, I have never seen mindfulness in an organizational context used to help people work harder. It's almost always the opposite. And for her, it was learning how to create space in her life. And so we looked at what was this phrase, I'm responsible, how did it play out in her life? And I'm responsible meant I'm responsible for people's pain. And she said, I realize that I'm always putting myself in between others and pain, whether it's my clients or the people that I work with or even my fellow partners. I'm putting myself in front of their pain, and I'm absorbing their pain. Right? I'm responsible. And so we did a little bit of work, and she realized, oh, they're responsible for their pain. And she has this vision of herself as a superhero, right, to try to protect others. And she realized, she goes, oh, the fact that I make myself a superhero dehumanizes me. Right? And that I take on more than I should, and that I deny my own humanity. Right? So that was last month's conversation. So we'll see. I'll report back in 6 weeks to see what happens. But, so she's now gradually starting to see how she's creating her own suffering, right? And that people are responsible for their own pain as a means of growing. And that she said, I don't have to be a warrior trying to protect people, but I can be their companion to help them through it. Right? So that's what we do. Right? And it's really incredible work. I think, what do you think is going on with them when this happens? Right? I guess that's my question for you. Why is it that when you take away the reactive process, that these things, this kind of wisdom naturally emerges? What do you think is happening? Right. In 1957, this book was published 2 years after that. I found something that Peter Drucker wrote, that society needed to return to spiritual values. In this case, he meant compassion from a Christian point of view. Not to offset materialism. Right? He was worried that we would become this highly materialistic society, and that it would, that would deaden our own humanity in a way. But his vision was, how do you fuse what our material competence and our internal abilities to make a civilization that was truly a productive one, and productive in this case meaning one that gave life. Right? And I think that's maybe what is starting to happen here. So thank you. Just one quick thing. We started the Executive Mind Leadership Institute this year, and our next program, it's dedicated really to help social leaders and social innovators. Our next program, which will be in February, will be for public safety police leaders, and called Leading in the Crucible. So if you know any good cops who want to come to LA in the middle of February, please let me know. So thank you.